Welcome everybody to our speaker series for the Center for Energy in the Future. Good to see many faces, some of which are my students, but not all of the students have I made to be here, and so welcome to the rest of you as well. And then welcome to the large faculty contingent there, plus Brittany and Adam, and as well as the members of the public. Many of you I've seen at these events before, so I welcome you back to Lycoming's campus, and obviously hope that this, like our other talks, have been of value to spark discussions around energy in all of its many forms and all of the way it impacts our lives, whether that's at the local level, a national level, or in the case of tonight's talk, at the global level. It is my pleasure to welcome Richard Hansen and Lyoness Aquino to campus tonight. They have been tremendous resources and sources of ideas for us as we've worked to develop our energy projects, in this case in the Dominican Republic, connected to our Warrior Coffee project. And our chemistry and education research that is happening in the Dominican Republic as well. Let me use that as a caveat, as a opportunity to advertise. Make sure you get some Warrior Coffee to enjoy this evening out in the lobby, along with some great cookies and other healthy things. And you can also pick up Warrior Coffee in the bookstore or in Wegmans whenever you get the chance to try that out, and we can tell you more about that program another night. To introduce Richard and Lyoness, they have a couple different titles, as many of us do. They are here representing the Energy Access Foundation, which has the mission, more or less, and they'll talk about this more in detail, of expanding energy access in the developing world. In particular, because access to energy is difficult when you don't have capital and you don't have infrastructure in place. Their work has focused around solar energy. In fact, Richard has been in the space of solar energy since the early 1980s, and so is really a pioneer in that world, where he's consulted around the world and really focused a lot of his own work in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, and in Honduras. Lyoness is a native Dominican who lived in a solar PV home until age 10 when she came to the United States, and in addition to her work, works with the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Richard also is involved with a company that sells solar products in Honduras, particular, called SOLUZ. And so between the two of them, they have a lot of tremendous expertise they've been able to share with the students today, with the faculty today, and in our time together, both on the phone and in the Dominican Republic. And so I think we will all benefit from their perspective on the challenges faced in the developing world in terms of energy access that's affordable and sustainable, and what they've done and experienced and learned about how to overcome some of those challenges. So please join me in welcoming them to Lycoming College tonight, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't spent all that much time in Pennsylvania, but I did start my career in energy in Pennsylvania with Westinghouse Electric Corporation, where I spent time in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I had 5 or 6 years of involvement with coal-fired, oil-fired, and nuclear power plants. So I got a chance to see what the large-scale 1,000-megawatt power sector was about. But I was fortunate to have an interest in looking at renewable energy, and I looked at technology, and I stumbled into photovoltaic technology, like a direct conversion of sunlight to electricity, and that combined with my interest in Latin America and having some Spanish classes, and I kind of combined those interests and pursued this. So, tonight we're going to talk about solar technology in developing countries, and in the context of sustainable energy for all, really looking how do you get access out there to people who are still in areas that have no infrastructure. So our company, SOLUZ Inc., and most of my work has been under SOLUZ Inc., the Energy Access Foundation. I'm glad to be combining our talks tonight with Lyoness, where I'm giving back in a charitable fashion with the foundation. But we have the company in Boston. It's got two sides of the business. So we do consulting work and some of the advisory work for the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank for planning, energy planning in Haiti, for example, which is the country in this hemisphere with the least amount. And then the product side, which is through SOLUZ Honduras. So we actually have a company that delivers solar technology. We established in 1994 and continue to deliver products. It's essentially a social enterprise because it makes a profit, but it also has a pretty good social impact. So, in the context of what we're working, and this isn't my focus in terms of the science and all, but the issue of the greenhouse effect, where you've got greenhouse gases that are, within the atmosphere that we need to keep the Earth warm. There's an issue of increasing carbon dioxide that increases the amount of energy, that heat from the sun that stays in and can lead to global warming, a changing climate. So, we look at the growing population. We're all on the same planet, and I was born in 1954. And in 1954, we were 2.7 billion people on the planet, sharing the Earth. And, you look where we are now, we're at about 7.6 billion. So, we've got a growing population, and I'm still a young guy, right? And, it's increased quite a bit in my lifetime. And when it comes to the carbon emission side of this from fossil fuels, well, when I was born, there was about 2,000 metric tons per year of 2,000 million, 2 billion essentially, metric tons per year. And that's going up like 5 times. Again, so within my lifetime. So we can see that these are trends that are happening. If you look over the longer term, with tens of thousands of years, we've got a recent period of time where it's gone over the historical levels. I mean, even looking back in hundreds of thousands of years, that in this time period we've gone up and we're now above 400 parts per million. So there's this increasing level of CO2, which can increase the temperature. And over the years, we've seen temperature rise going up, the averages. So I'm not a scientist studying this. We essentially are, though, involved with the context of this issue of moving towards sustainable energy, energy that emits less carbon. And our role in this is a piece of this puzzle, to move in that direction. But another thing we can look at is kind of the per capita carbon. So in the United States, we've got like 18 metric tons per capita per year of carbon emissions. And you can see how there's other countries around the world at different levels, some a little bit higher. Then there's also European countries a bit lower there. Look at developing countries, Brazil, India, you can see how there's a range in kind of the average what people would be emitting, and we can take actions to address this. We can even look at that at like the state level. Now here we are in Pennsylvania. I looked up a number there, and you can see it on the chart. It's roughly about 19. So it's a little bit over the national average here in Pennsylvania. You can take action to do stuff on that. Now, Willie and I came in from Massachusetts. We seem to have had a number of programs that helped with efficiency and whatnot. So it's about 10 tons. So we can look at different areas and we're living pretty well in Massachusetts, and we got a little bit more. But anyways, the context of this, the United Nations has declared the decade from 2014 to 2024 as the decade of sustainable energy for all. And so that's kind of creating a framework for organizations to move towards 3 goals. And these goals, the first goal is to ensure universal access to modern energy services around the world, because there's still over 1 billion people without any access to electricity, for example. The second goal is to really double the share of renewable energy in the mix. So more, whether it's geothermal or wind, into the energy mix. And then the third goal, and there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of low-hanging fruit still in this rate of improvement in energy efficiency. So that's the framework. I mean, what we're doing, I'd say now, I started on this before that framework existed, but I think now we're working kind of in that context. And here we've got a chart when you look at energy poverty, so this energy access piece, you can see the electricity is in blue. You can see the big number of population there in sub-Saharan Africa, close to 600 million people without access to electricity. The green is the modern cooking fuels. India is the country really with the largest number of people without access to electricity. And our focus of work has been primarily on electricity. There's also the cooking side of this. Latin America, where we've worked over quite a number of years, it's now a fairly small number, 31 million or so in the region without access. So now we're going to get down to what we do. It's the use of solar photovoltaic technology, conversion of sunlight to electricity in these off-grid areas. And when I started this, I wanted to be able to give you kind of a historical thing and show where it's gone to, because the good thing is I got down this path and it wasn't really a dead end. It's advanced a lot, so that's kind of a good thing. You go off the beaten path, and then so the cost of the technology when I started in like '84 in the '80s, it was about $10 a watt, and you could see these photovoltaic modules with the round cells, and they had like a 5-year warranty. So that's where the technology was at. But it made sense in areas that didn't have access to the electric grid, even in the 1980s, because people were using kerosene and dry cells. So if you look at the Dominican Republic, which is a country that I visited, and then as an engineer working in the energy field, and I started to realize, while I was born with a light switch next to my bed, there were a lot of people in the Dominican Republic that didn't have power, and a lot of people in the world. So in '84, I got involved in introducing PV technology for off-grid areas. And the population at the time was about 6 million people, 30% of those off the grid. If you looked at the rural area, that was about half the population, 3 million people. And it was really the rural areas that the infrastructure had not reached because it wasn't cost effective. The population is dispersed and the demand is not as high to really recover the cost. So the rural areas, 2 million people without access, you had 65% of the population without power, about 400,000 households. So I got to immerse myself in this problem and worked on that. Here I am back in that time frame, quite a bit younger, but this fellow, Felipe Martinez, who was a real pioneer in the use of solar because he was the first household, and then behind the bush over here, they had a little store, so people would come up and buy things at the store. So, lighting, radio and television, because people in the area were carrying car batteries down to the town to charge the battery up, be able to run a TV, using dry cells. And the power from dry cells is on the order of $50 a kilowatt hour. So you get it 15 cents a kilowatt hour of the wall socket here, but down there the poor rural campesinos, listening to the news or music would pay $50. So that was kind of the introduction of this. It was a combination of a simple PV system, photovoltaic system, with a microfinance payment plan. And Felipe faithfully paid a 4-year payment plan that we provided for him. I personally provided it at that point and trusted him, and we got to know each other quite well. I knew him until his death several years ago. This was kind of a killer app, as they would call it, where you've got this package that was useful for households. You've got the PV module, the small controller, battery, the lighting. At the time, they were like cassette players back then, and black and white TVs that the Japanese would put like a Toshiba TV set, had a jack on the back for 12 volts to run it off a battery. People around the world use them off the batteries. Here's a nice looking typical Dominican home on the North Coast with a PV module there. And we did some work to really look at what people were spending, and we could see that 50% of the population in 1998 in both, we looked at Honduras and Dominican Republic, spending like $6 a month, and then like 25% of the population spending on the order of $10. And you can see there's people, 10% of the population spending up here, getting close to $18, $20 a month. So people were already spending money on kerosene, so you could put that towards a payment plan and invest in the technology even at that time. And we looked at that and realized that there were people that could buy systems, a system that would be on the order of $400 or $1,000 in that range with a harvest, on a cash basis. They could pay at the harvest, or they could sell an animal, a couple of pigs or a cow, and they could buy a system. And then if you provided microcredit, you get a little bit more penetration into the economic pyramid here. And then we actually got into a rental approach where if they didn't qualify for microcredit, they could rent that. But it did still leave perhaps half the population without being able to purchase that, we would really need subsidies or some other solutions that today have actually emerged. You know, it's always been about connecting with other people and building, you know, kind of the capacity to, you know, advance this. So we were fortunate, the U.S. Department of Energy, which was funding through the laboratories this type of technology, wondering, you know, like, where are the markets for this? And so I ended up on the side of like the marketing side, where I was, you know, in the Dominican Republic, and with that, we had a couple folks from the Sandia National Lab here, Max Harcourt, Beth Richards. They came down, and that's actually at the home of this fellow, Felipe Martinez, that was in that black and white photo. And I was explaining to them that there, and then at my house in the Dominican Republic, at kind of an eco lodge out there in the countryside, we had several people came in, and here's a couple of guys that came in there. The guy on the left, he was in the U.S. Peace Corps in Honduras. So we had developed a relationship with the Peace Corps where, you know, these volunteers were, this guy was Princeton educated, really talented guy, you know, working in rural areas. So we had some Peace Corps people come over to Honduras for replication, and the U.S. Department of Energy funded the replication of this to introduce, in 1989, photovoltaic technology for rural electrification in Honduras. This fellow, John, ended up working with me after Peace Corps and helping to set up this company, SOLUZ. The guy next to him, this fellow over here, now Dr. Harish Handi, he was with the University of Mass, Lowell, where Lyoness also works part-time. And, you know, it's a university that has this solar engineering program. It's been there for quite a while. So in 1991, he came over to the Dominican Republic. And as he looked at the distributed technology, he realized this looks a lot like my state of Karnataka in India. And he ended up founding a company called Selco India. So we did quite a bit of work kind of introducing the technology. Then in Honduras, I got involved with setting up, since our company in Massachusetts was formed in '93 and we raised some capital, and we set up a company in Honduras, SOLUZ Honduras. You can see the beautiful countryside areas out here, you know, where another area where coffee is grown, right? And people that raise coffee are often in these areas that are mountainous and don't have electricity. And you know, there's the black and white TV, the boom box, and there was a market in Honduras of like 6 million people is the total population, about 3 million without access at that time in '94, and these were the basic systems with a few lights, TV, radio. But now we still have that company going, and it's got based in San Pedro Sula, which is an industrial city, and then also in Ceiba, and we've delivered over 20,000 systems to households and enterprises, and also schools, community facilities, clinics. And our general manager, Andres Carvajal, has been there for 14 years. He came out of the microfinance industry, and he does a good job of running the company. And he was in a training workshop way back, and then he kind of went through that because he was in microfinance, and then he showed up at our door and was wondering whether he could get a position at the company 14 years ago, and we did. So now the Dominican Republic is supposed to be like 95% electrified. So I wanted to point out here, just in terms of Latin America, there's been urbanization and electrification, and I showed that chart with the blue bubbles in there. These are now the countries that are more than 10% of the population doesn't have access, and Haiti really is at the top of the list there with roughly 70%, and Honduras is next, and Nicaragua, Bolivia. Peru's got the second largest number of people, but it's about 10%. It's got a high population there. Many mountainous areas in Peru. It's challenging to reach those areas with the electrical grid, you know, the poles and lines approach. So, you know, this can kind of leapfrog that or be a pre-electrification. But, you know, what's been good is to see over the years, and, you know, I'm still in this, and in 2012, we saw some pretty significant price decline in solar technology, which has you know, resulted in many states in the United States having grid-tied solar and getting a lot of larger projects happening because it fell well below $1 a watt, and, you know, now the warranties are 25 years. So fortunately, those little kind of clunky panels at the round cells that were the early panels with 5-year warranty have continued to improve. So we didn't do any of this because we don't produce the technology. We're just taking advantage of the technology that's available. And fortunately, other people, you know, spending their career on improving the efficiency and the quality of these. So what's that allowed? It means that you can do more productive applications. For the last 10 years or so, we've been doing solar refrigeration, which is a good application. This is a woman in Honduras. Also, another thing that's emerged over the last years, like the last 5 or 6 years, are these very small packaged products. So when I had pointed out that you look at this pyramid, And you got a whole, 50% that can't really get anything unless you get other solutions. These solutions are emerging because the LED lights now are very high lumens per watt. It's over 100. You're getting up to even 200 on some of these. And then you got the lithium batteries in there, and you got the panel prices coming down. So you get this nice little package that provides lighting and cell phone charging. These small products that have emerged as quality certified projects under this even World Bank funded program called Lighting Africa. Now it's called Lighting Global. And that's because of the large market that I pointed out, of about 600 million people without electricity in Africa. It's like there's a huge market and they're spending $27 billion a year on kerosene. Let's replace that. And so this stuff's moving forward. So I went to Senegal and picked up some products for Honduras, and that's Marion in our office. You can see kind of in the background, you got some LED lights up here, you got batteries and whatnot. And we could take advantage of what was being developed for the African market for Honduras. But let's hit you over to India a bit here. So solar PV, to get this global, here's Harish Handi again. And you can see a photo of a house in India there. And that market, with a population of about 1.2 billion, like 300 million without access, there's a big need in India. So he could spend quite a bit of time if he wanted to try and do it all himself. It's a good thing he's actually not. But you can see a typical solar kit that company, Selco India, was formed in '95. And you can see how in the first 10 years, this takes time, but the first 10 years, he got up to, are you getting consistent sound on this? Can you hear me okay? Oh, you can switch it out? Yeah, it's going in and out a bit. Are we on now? Okay, that's good. So it's pretty good. He was a student, visited me as a master's student, got his PhD, and started the company in 1995. And by 2005, he had practically 50,000 households electrified. It turns out that India has this very significant rural banking. You actually have like rural finance in India, and so he could take advantage of that. And he delivers the technology, and then the local bank branches finance it, which was really quite good. Anyways, like just a few years ago, so he visited me in '91. Just a few years ago, he's doing the commencement speech. He's kind of a hero over at UMass Lowell because he's been very successful. On the right, there's an energy store, kind of an example of one of the innovations. But, Selco now has 45 branches. They have over 300 employees. They've done over 400,000 households. So, they've really been able to, move this along. The thing is, though, he's not just looking at scale of his own company. He's really looking at scale through replication. So he's established the Selco Foundation in 2010, and they're really helping other people get into the business and also supporting innovations. And he's done very well on raising funds. In fact, on just this month, on April 2nd, they were awarded a Social Entrepreneur Award from the Skoll Foundation, $1.25 million. And in January, from the Zayed Fund, which is from Dubai, that's $1.5 million, and he was given a Magsaysay Award, which is kind of the Asian Nobel Peace Prize, more or less, in Asia. He's done very well and he's a strong voice in this use of solar for livelihoods and lifting people out of poverty. So it's been quite good. And in the process of this, we've been working with enterprises, and so in the context of a study we did with Navik Consulting, kind of identified some key elements that you can look at to achieve scale through SMEs or small and medium enterprises. One being an enabling environment. So that the policy side of this, you're looking at, there's multidisciplinary to make this happen. You need finance, you need technology, but the policy side, you need to have an enabling environment to facilitate whether it's the importation or policies related to electrification planning. Also, you need to have enterprise finance has to come in for working capital and build the enterprises. Consumer finance, because the consumer has an asset there, so one way or another that has to be financed. And then fourth one here being innovation funding, really, it's a bit of a stretch to expect all of the kind of capacity building and innovation to come out of the margins from poor rural families. So you kind of have to catalyze that if we're going to see an acceleration to help make a dent in this 1 billion plus people that don't yet have access on the planet. Let's visit Africa for just a moment. I'll touch base on that. It's been, like I mentioned earlier, well, it's a significant market, so that helps drive the interest in this, and the governments don't have the wherewithal to reach the rural areas. In many places it's just 15% electrification, 20% electrification, and these solar lanterns are rapidly replacing the kerosene in the African continent. Companies now have brought in this consumer financing, like they're willing to finance, investors are willing to invest, in part because they've engaged pay-as-you-go technology, similar to the cell phones, where you can like pay for minutes and then it'll shut off when you run out of minutes. Well, you can run a solar kit for a month and then you make a payment, and when that payment runs out, the thing will shut off until you put some more time into it. So there's this pay-as-you-go technology that actually helps assure that people end up making payments on their payment plan because the device will shut off, similar to like a cell phone. The other thing that's happening, and I just came back in January, I was over in Hong Kong at the Global Off-Grid Solar Forum and Expo, and I had been, when I first looked at these small products in the Senegal, Lighting Africa in 2012. Well, 5 years later, it was noticeable that they've gone from kind of basic little kits with lighting and cell phone to larger systems. So a lot's happening in Africa now with larger systems, and both households as well as for businesses. And you're seeing some pretty significant operations there. Several of these are up to 100,000 customers, companies such as Azuri Technology. You can Google these and see what they're all about. Phoenix. There's a very interesting one, Solar Sister. That's a nonprofit organization, but they support local women entrepreneurs, and they've trained on the order of like 1,000 women entrepreneurs. Very interesting program that really developed the training that's needed and the technology to kind of track sales and how to really support and empower the women to become distributors of solar technology kits. That's been interesting. There's MCOPA, Mobisol. But another thing that's happening is it really is bringing in investment now. So in 2014, in this off-grid solar space, you had about 75 million in investment. 2015, about 207 million, and then 2016, $317 million. So you're seeing, some serious money coming into these companies. Those aren't, grants. You're getting investment is taking place. So that's interesting. I happen to be doing an evaluation for the World Bank over in Ethiopia, and I took this picture of this young girl here with a solar lantern. And Ethiopia is an interesting case because it's like 90 million people, only 15% have access to energy. And there's where like all of our DNA comes from. The emergence of Homo sapiens over in Eastern Africa. There's actually a good museum there with the a lot of the archaeological work, but there's a lot of potential on the African continent. There's a lot of need, and it's taking off. It's pretty exciting. It's good to see. It's good to be around for that. What I've gone through is just a quick tour across some regions. The regions are different on the off-grid side of solar, which has been cost-effective for 30 years, and it's just getting better, and you get these new products. But I also wanted to show a bit about solar for developing countries. That's now the grid-tied, because with that decline of price and these larger, longer warranty modules, you're getting more opportunities for grid-tied projects. And that's got quite a growth around the world. I'm not talking about developing countries in the case of this graph. This is the overall expansion here. So you got the prices coming down. You're looking like $100 a watt and 75. As prices come down, and remember I talked about a significant decline in prices here in 2012 in this time frame. And as that prices come down, and it's made the unit cost of energy be quite competitive, the sales in megawatts of solar has just really skyrocketed and continues to grow. So that's pretty exciting. I'm glad to be able to see that happen. There's a number of market segments in the use of the technology for grid-tied. One would be the utility scale. and systems that are large, 5 to 500 megawatts. Power supply prices now on some of these utility scale are under 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Then there's the industrial and commercial scale projects that might be 100 kilowatts to 5 megawatts, and they could either be systems that are purchased by the user, or they could be under a power purchase agreement, which I understand is how, for example, Walmart would use systems, is they're essentially is a third party that owns the system. And then there's the one that I'm more involved with, which is, I call it solar PV for all, because these are smaller PV systems that you can put into social institutions like schools and clinics, small businesses and residences. So it's, the sun kind of shines for everybody because you can make use of it, on a building by building basis. You can't stick a hydropower facility on your roof, but you can stick this. So, it's got a particular benefit in that regard. Here's an example of a utility scale. This is a recently completed project this year. It's 750 megawatts in Mexico. It's a project done by Nextracker for Enel Green Power. Enel's an Italian utility that's done a lot of green power projects. So that's a pretty impressive array of solar modules there. Here's an industrial scale project. This is in Honduras. That's on the Pepsi-Cola bottling manufacturing facility down there. A company by the name of Smart Solar put in that project. They started with a pilot, like 260 kilowatts, and they took that step and then took the next step by having a kind of a pilot in place and got $5 million from a loan for Inter-American Development Bank to finance 3 megawatts. So it's an impressive coverage of the roof space there to cover self-consumption. Now this PV for all, this angle I like, the social institutions, when you've got a nonprofit that really wants to provide education, like, here you're providing education, what you want to do is to educate people. You don't want to pay the electric company, right? So same thing with clinics and, nonprofit organizations. So if they can do an investment, like a one-time capital raising campaign, and kind of excite potential donors, and they can make that investment, then they can control their electricity expenses and spend their money on the programs rather than the electric company. And you can also see the physical investment. You can monitor it and track it. And these systems, whether it's 5 kilowatts that give you, say, 600 kilowatt hours a month of electricity and energy, or 100 kilowatts that give you, say, 12,000, that's very useful range for these organizations. And here's an example of a school, Lyoness School. That's a Swiss-funded school, and they also funded the solar system that's on there, 12.7 kilowatts, and those panels are on there. And we did this project in Honduras, and our team did that. It was about $3.50 a watt installed at that time in 2012. That was one of the early projects we've done. And there's work that's still needed to get the enabling environment fully in place in Honduras with the bi-directional metering, whereby you get credit for energy you send. And that's kind of in the works. This project, you can see how it's got this racking. This is professional racking that makes it a nice, neat job to install. And then you can see there's a 11.4 kilowatt inverter that synchronizes with the grid, and here it was producing 8.3 kilowatts at that time. Here's Andres Carvajal, the general manager, and technician Adis, who were involved in installing that. So it's a nice example of a school that can cut down their electric bill by having that on the roof. Here's an example of a small business. It happens to be our office in San Pedro Sula. So there's a 5 kilowatt system on the roof, and you can see we're in an industrial city there. And in that array, inside it's got this Solectria 3.8 kilowatt inverter that synchronizes with the electric grid. So we consume power, but then anything that we need that we don't produce with solar, that comes in from the electric company. And a cool thing we can do is, like, I can be sitting in my office in Massachusetts, I can be watching, well, here's the power consumed, this red line here, that's the power consumed. And so I can monitor our consumption in there with this monitoring system, web-based monitoring. And you can see I can tell when the employees walk in the morning, turn on the air conditioning in the computers, and then you've got the green line is the power produced by the solar. So what we end up doing, the red area is the energy consumed, and then the white area, that's the energy that we are using from the solar. So we can carve out a big piece of our energy consumption during the daytime. And it matches kind of nicely because you're at the office during the day, we're working during the day, and the sun is up during the day. So it's a self-consumption. And we can monitor that and how it's doing. So you can see right there, that's like where it peaks out during the middle of the day. And when it comes to education, here's a project we did with the Instituto Técnico Loyola. It's a technical trade school in El Progreso, Honduras. And in this case, we brought in students from the University of Massachusetts. And it's a technical trade school. We also had like the electrical trade students working on that. So we had the electrical trade guys in there, and we had the UMass Lowell solar engineering program. So we've engaged students, which, you know, I really like, you know, speaking at a university to open the door to, you know, collaborate where we can. And in this case, the university, we had that case of Harish Handi, who from India, and just recently, actually, this fellow's from Pakistan, this fellow's from India. There's another fellow, it's not in that picture, from Ivory Coast. They had quite a number of international students, and they got a chance to come down and be involved with that project. So anyways, I've given you a little bit of a tour based upon real experience and real projects on the use of solar technology in developing countries. You know, I mean, in many ways, we can all engage in what is this transition, global transition to sustainable energy, and make somewhat of a difference, whether it's on our own angle and how we have it at home, or, you know, in energy efficiency or solar. But one thing I want to do now is give Lyoness a chance to talk about what she's been doing under the Energy Access Foundation back on the island of Hispaniola, where she was born. And I'll shut up and give Lyoness a chance. And I know we're available for questions, so I'll step out.
Morning, guys. Or no, night, not morning. So let me just get this open. So you kind of have a little bit of a background of where I'm from in my work. I work with the Energy Access Foundation part-time, and now I work with University of Massachusetts Lowell, helping them bring in some income into their energy engineering programs, Solar for Wind Energy, Center for Wind Energy, and their climate change initiative programs there. And so I have sort of the state's background as well as the international with the work in Dominican Republic. But the Energy Access Foundation was a 501c3 nonprofit established in Massachusetts in 2007. Our mission is sort of to increase energy access, clean renewable energy, underserved populations. We want to alleviate poverty, expand economic development, and protect the environment, directly or indirectly with the work that we're doing. Richard gave you a little bit of a peek at this graph here, but the island of Hispaniola has the greatest amount of need in the Americas, with Haiti being the country with the greatest number of people without access to electricity. There's about 10 million Haitians on that part of the island. To give you a little bit of my context here, Haiti and Dominican Republic share one island. A lot of people sort of talk about Haiti and the Dominican Republic sort of as that they are their own island, but essentially they share one. And so it's the island of Hispaniola. And the Haitians, they have the same amount of population, about 10 million in Dominican Republic and 10 million in Haiti, but they don't really share the same space. The Dominican Republic has more land. One of our programs is the Quisqueya program. Here you see it spelled two ways. One way, the one with the QU, is the Dominican way of spelling it, the Spanish. And the Quisqueya with the K is the Haitian Creole way of spelling it. So we want to really have those two ways of spelling because it really is the history of the whole island. But our goal under the Quisqueya program is to increase that access. We want to support and work with local enterprises to increase that sustainability aspect over time. We want to support that cross-border collaboration between the two nations, which, if you know a little bit of history, it's not always in a collaborative way. There's some sort of competition or, how to say, immigrant access and racial background that they clash. And so we want to sort of bridge that gap and not have collaboration. We also want to support educational PV products to engage youth in their transition to a more solar technology and renewable energy, because the youth essentially are our future, and if they get that spark, they can really advance the technology in the island. So one of our projects under the Quisqueya program is the Pico PV for Haiti project. So as Richard mentioned earlier and introduced you to this word, the Pico. So Pico are small plug-and-play solar PV products that have come into the market after the drop in price in 2012. Something similar, I have an example here. Something like this. You know, you have a little stand, you have some lighting. This has 3 levels of lighting, but also you can charge a cell phone in the back. This is one level. You have a smaller level as well, where you only have light, no cell phone charging, and they differ in price as well. Up to a little bit bigger, where you have a couple of lighting units with maybe a light switch and charging of the cell phone. So and they range in price, depending from $10 all the way up to maybe $200. So really, you can saturate that 50% of the market that might not be able to afford a bigger solar home system that Richard was showing earlier in his presentation. So we partner with a local enterprise, SolarWave. Raquel is there on the right, the one sort of trying to touch the lantern there. So she's located in the Dominican Republic side. She does all of the importing of the products. She also has an employee who is Dominican but of Haitian descent, who speaks Haitian Creole. So our model is to support women entrepreneurs, not only in the Dominican side, but also in the Haitian side as well, to adapt that working at the Haitian border, that cross-border collaboration. So I sort of gave you an introduction here of what the lamps look like. Here you can see the bigger system with a couple of lights and light switches. So the reason why we have identified the Sun King branded product, it's manufactured by Greenlight Planet, but they are high quality products, which differs from a lot of the products that come into Haiti. There's a lot of aid that comes into Haiti, and so they get a lot of products that are, I used this word earlier, they're crap. They only last maybe a year or two. And so for a Haitian family who's investing in lighting by buying kerosene or paying to charge a battery, making an investment in a solar light that goes away in a year or two, it's not worth it. Whereas this lasts a lot longer, maybe about this has a lifetime of 5 years, has a 2-year warranty. It goes a long way. And this is a transition, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But it's certified by the Lighting Global program of the World Bank Group. So we know that it's a high quality product. And this is Raquel in her office, but she has vast experience in importing solar products in the Dominican Republic. So she does all of the importing of these Pico PV products into the Dominican Republic, which is a little bit smoother than trying to import it into Haiti, which is a little bit more instability. But she has over a decade in the solar business with being an Energy Access Foundation, EAF partner. She's also demonstrated her integrity and honesty over the decades and dedication to the energy access and that cross-border work into Haiti. And to give you a little bit more of a picture of exactly where Raquel does most of her work, and we focus on this, Raquel's office is about 3 hours away from the border. So you see there, the Jabon is in the Dominican side, and Guadaminte is on the Haitian side. But there is this market in the Dajabon that the border opens every Monday and Friday. And there are thousands of Haitian women. There's probably about 90 to 95% of women that come from all around Haiti to the market to sell donated goods from developed countries. So all these goods come into Haiti, but they don't really have a use for it or a need for it. So what do? They try and sell it to the more affluent Dominican players who can pay for those goods as an income. So we want, Raquel is identifying entrepreneurial women who can buy these Pico PV products from her, 1 to 5, depending on their income, and they can go ahead to their community in Haiti and sell it and have a source of income as well. So she has that entrepreneurial business. So with that collaboration, so they're able to eliminate their purchase of kerosene and charging of batteries, but also charging their cell phone. About every Haitian has a cell phone, but they pay to get them charged for their use. So these lanterns are able to eliminate that cost. And this is sort of, the model is to develop a team of qualified and trained women entrepreneurs. We want to build a delivery chain and scale up. The sustainability of this is that if EAF essentially disappears and we're not a part of it, the Haitian women have Raquel in the country to go for their support for anything they need. Raquel is doing all of the importing, having most of the training there, and they can build that support system in between themselves to build that skill and that capital. So our role is to have that charitable support to make these lanterns more affordable for the Haitian women, because they're not able to necessarily afford this high quality product at the price that Raquel is able to import into the Dominican Republic. So by us making it, creating that fast rebate is what we're calling it, the Haitian woman is able to buy them up and resell it in their community and have that model. So you can see here that our interpretation of FAST is their first access to solar. So it's able to get them this first access that they can maybe build up their capital to move on to larger home systems and maybe some more productive uses within their community or their own home, and have more capital for their children's education, maybe improve their housing and economic development. Oh, and I forgot to mention here, you have sort of an example of the before and after of the lighting situation. So, not much lighting for them to do their homework, and then after they can do that and charge their cell phones as well. So my first project under the Energy Access Foundation in 2016 was in the Bella Vista School, which is actually the community that I grew up in Dominican Republic. And Bella Vista has a unique history with PV because of Richard's start there in 1984. And that's how I was able to grow up in a solar home for the first 10 years of my life. And the youth of Bella Vista, with Richard's work, were able to get inspired and build their own business in solar. Erickson Rivera, which I know personally, Jose, and others have been able to create their own businesses. The town recently built a new school through the government, has been building new schools in the country, and the town was selected as one of those towns. And so we put a 4-kilowatt array there with a 6-kilowatt hybrid inverter to reduce the energy they consume, but also give them the power to, when the grid goes out, for that backup power. So they have batteries to power a laptop, some lighting, or some fans as well when it's really hot. We also integrated energy education into the project, because the kids can be educated in the technology, but also know the impact that it gives them. Like, oh, we weren't able to power this laptop 10 months ago, but now we're able to do so continuously with no interruption. And so here in the white, that's Erickson. His company is called Energy Light, but he was able to do the install in the school. So the kids not only saw the impact of having the solar in the school, but they got to see their own member of the community doing the install, which they can sort of see. It was like, well, wow, somebody from my own community is able to do this. Maybe I can go that route as well. And there I am after we we finished everything, sort of giving them a show and tell of the system after the fact as well, which they already knew a little bit because the teachers were able to tell them a little bit about it, but it was great to see that interaction. And as well, even though I'm not a permanent member of the community, I did come from there, and I have had a little bit more of opportunity because of me being in the United States. But also, girls in the Dominican Republic don't really have much of a path in a professional manner. Usually they're given 3 modes or 4 modes of going into business, into a professional. Usually they end up just being a housewife, essentially. So my commitment is sort of empowering girls to go into not sustainable energy, but pursue their dreams, essentially. But the school has about 200 students, 10% are of Haitian descent. With that education component, we were able to partner with UMass Lowell, and 2 students out of the energy engineering program were able to come down for the project and be a part of the installation, but also give a presentation. They were speaking in English, and Raquel there was the translator. But they did the presentation in English, they wrote it out, and then they used Google Translate to translate it in Spanish, and were able to show the presentation in Spanish to the students, which was great. But the students got to see, the Dominican students got to see how involved in another way of a graduate student level being international of those 2 that went to the project. So again, that's another level of inspiration for them to pursue and see. But that's pretty much it. So a question that we always ask is, how do we have the public, not only students, but people professionally, not professionally, collaborate? A way is to help small enterprises like Raquel's, but also donating to the Energy Access Foundation with students. I always say it's a way, like the UMass Lowell students, get involved in a project like the one that I did, but also, even if that's you're not able to do that, also locally in the United States, you can get involved and have that enabling environment of helping along policy, educating people who might not know or be aware of the technology or education. I always say it's almost like you need to walk your talk, and a way is, it might be small and you might not think you're creating an impact, but sometimes just one word you say might spark the inspiration of someone. So, thank you.
I hope you learned something. I know I do every time I talk to them or hear from them. As regular guests of the Center for Energy and the Future's speaker series know, the kind of next phase of what we do is try to connect our speakers to each other over time. And so we always sit down for a few minutes, ask a few questions that I try to ask more or less consistently from one speaker to the next. So that we as an audience can then compare their answers and see which ones are more convincing, which ones might be less convincing to us, but have that conversation over time that's really a part of the mission that we have for the center. And then maybe I can get them to ask the next speakers, who I don't even know who they are, what the question they're going to have to answer will be. So after that, we'll open it up for general questions to the audience, and so hopefully you have thought of some that we can pursue at that point. So I have a long list. It'll only take a couple hours to get through. You know, and clearly, I feel like I'm going to play tennis here. Clearly, in the work that you've done, focusing on renewable energy, solar energy in the developing world, you know, that's part of a bigger, complex set of human energy systems that are in the midst of evolution in a lot of different directions simultaneously. And so the biggest picture question that I think I can ask and have asked of other speakers in our series is, what do you see as our overarching energy future? What does humanity's energy future look like? And 10 words or less. No, I'm just kidding. But just that picture, where are we headed as a species in terms of our energy systems overall? If you extend what you know and your focus to the biggest picture that you can think of.
You want me to
Sure.
step up? All right. So, I've been fortunate to be able to go to numerous places on the planet and, get a sense on where we're at. I mean, the energy access issue is big, but with the population growing and really the need for people to rise out of, rise up their economic level, we, particularly if we're going to address the issue of climate change, we really need, we've got the climate change, we've got the poverty issue. We really need to have significant international collaboration. I think that we need to move fairly quickly to sustainable low carbon energy sources because if every country and if people are going to raise their economic levels with the older model, I don't think it works. It's like maybe I was born into that, but once you start to look at that picture, and I got into the energy industry and the conventional side, so we really need to make that that international collaboration to be deep and accelerated. And so I see the vision that we can do it if we can build that level of collaboration, and policy is a big side of that, and building the capacity. That's why I think that continuing to engage young people as well, really build the human capacity to operate in that level where we can collaborate internationally, accelerate this transition, the global transition to sustainable energy.
Like that?
I kind of, my thought is, since I've done a lot of work myself with lowering my own consumption, I think we need to work a little bit more can't say that word now, collaboratively, and more international. I think we get bogged down, especially in the developed world, of our own sort of movement and get stuck in our own life and don't have that world view. So I think if we put a little bit more of a global perspective and know that our own consumption sort of needs to be more efficient and be lowered, so that way the developed world can see a little bit of that and not sort of take our example, since sort of that's historically what has been done. They see us as an example, the developed world as an example of economic growth, and they sort of want to follow that. So if they can leapfrog that conventional way, I think we'll be better off in the future. And so if we ourselves lower that consumption, I think we'll be in a good place, and rapidly. And I think with younger generations, we see that. They're sort of acting more globally and taking their own charge of their consumption and things like that.
So if the energy future is this transition to renewable energy and reduced energy consumption, and if that future is one in which it requires rapid change, collaboration, modeling by the developing world to the developing world, what are the challenges? What are the barriers? What do we not know yet to be able to accomplish those? And then, what are the key, what has to happen to overcome those barriers? What has to happen to meet those challenges of that future that you envision?
I think the sharing of knowledge is important. for example, in a policy level, if I remember, like in Massachusetts, state of Massachusetts, and seeing how they began net metering and this whole long process of integrating in new technologies into the existing systems. A lot of work was done to develop the policies, and I think that needs to be shared quickly across borders, so it doesn't have to be reinvented. And clearly, the policies need to be also south-south, so that the policies are appropriate for developing countries. And I think that's a barrier in terms of, can we do that quickly enough and develop the models. There's a lot of vested interests, that need to be overcome, I think, by increased engagement of people in the process, so that can happen.
I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I think also the advancement in technology is not necessarily a barrier, but I think could help us a lot quicker with that. As we've explained, sort of the advancement in technology and things becoming cheaper, it's more adaptable and quicker, which also I found that in the developed, with my work in Massachusetts, a lot of that is highly subsidized. So I think the technology is going to help advance that more rapidly.
So if technological advances occur, then subsidies will be less necessary to make it more affordable, and the change will happen
Exactly.
more quickly. What if that doesn't happen? What if we don't make the transition? What if what are the consequences if none of that happens? What do you see? How, you thinking optimistically about what your ideal future in your minds look like? What are the consequences if we don't collaborate, if we don't educate, if we don't have technological innovation, and we don't transition to that future you envision?
Well, it can be very worrisome if we look at the graphs with carbon emissions and increasing temperature. Then perhaps not in my lifetime, but for future generations, we could find ourselves really affecting the climate significantly and displacing a lot of people. And so I just think that that's a very negative ultimate impact to drastically affect the climate if it just continues on the same pattern. I think we need to be positive and do everything we can, because that's the way to affect the change and not despair. But yeah, it could be very, very negative. We would need a lot of adaptation, and I don't know exactly how that would play out in terms of adaptation. It could be a lot of displaced people due to droughts, flooding, that nature. So, ultimately, that's, I think, a big concern for humanity. That's my understanding. I'm not the scientist that track all of that, but I think that countries, with the Paris Agreement, I think attempts to move towards sustainable energy are based upon, in a large part, upon that. And I think that the climate issue and poverty go hand in hand, because people are striving to increase their economic level. So that has to be done in a way that's not going to affect the climate. We're all in the same, and the carbon dioxide doesn't respect boundaries. We're all on the same planet. So if we aren't able to do it, I think it could be very negative. I got to keep positive and do everything we can.
Okay. One of the things I'd be interested in you expanding upon is that idea of the economic side consequences. If energy access through the transition doesn't change, how does that, climate change is one part of it, but simply economic and human development, how would the effects in that way occur?
There would be a lot of instability. Not only in the developed country, but also in the developed world, kind of that north and south, because we do a lot of trade. Taken as an example, the NAFTA agreement, the United States and Mexico, if we don't really sort of move towards a carbon neutral and advanced green technology, and sort of those technologies don't evolve and don't become cheaper for poverty and people who can't afford it be adapted and increase their economic level, it will hurt their own production and industry, which the developed world takes advantage of and uses. And so our own even the developed world will be unstable as well. And I think the economic development of the developed world will suffer. Not only the developing world, but also the developed world will suffer as well. So like Richard said, it will be very bleak. We can't, I sort of have almost a bleak view of the world already, which is crazy that I do this work, because I see as the developed world taking advantage of the developing countries. And if we don't advance in technology and that collaboration, systems will start to break down, I think. And so our own comfort level of what we're comfortable doing in our daily lives will start to break down.
Leaving that maybe at the wrong time as a topic, but to shift gears a little bit, maybe on the more optimistic side of things. Clearly, Lycoming College, as you know, is a liberal arts college where we, through the Center for Energy in the Future and coursework across a number of departments, are working to prepare students to engage with the world of energy, both in terms of citizens and, at least for some of them, individuals looking to build careers in some aspect of that energy world energy system. What's one thing that students within that liberal arts context should be doing now to better prepare themselves to engage in that world, either as citizens or in terms of a career?
Well, we talked about this a bit today, and I think that you've actually laid out some of the ways where you can get students get an exposure if they're interested in the international work, where they can start to take on internships and try and make themselves available, particularly if they can do it voluntarily, so they may not have to be able to reach the threshold of getting paid employment right away. So you try and get some track record going. I think that's the important thing for students to do. And one of the good things is that really the energy issue is very multidisciplinary. So people can come in from different areas of expertise, whether you're mentioning a liberal arts school, but whether it's engineering or business or the policy side of it, there's a lot of angles on this and many ways to play a role. And so it's important to, like one of the ways that we've seen people get into international work is getting involved, like with the U.S. Peace Corps. If they're, let's say, an American student that hasn't had international experience, then they can take that avenue to get greater time in a developing country and learn more culture, language. So really trying to get that experience, which makes them more attractive to organizations that are working internationally. And programs in the university that can help facilitate that, which clearly here you're doing that. Yeah.
And obviously you have quite a bit of experience with this yourself, so love to hear your perspective on your engagement and advice for students for theirs.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of educate yourselves on that interdisciplinary way, because a lot of these issues take into account a lot of different areas. And what I find is that a lot of the traditional ways of getting into a job is sort of very young, decide a trade or what you want to be or what you want to do as a career. But even if you do want to follow something very straight and narrow, educating yourselves on a little bit more of the different things. But also, we live in communities that we are, like in the United States, that are very diverse. And you don't necessarily have to visit these countries. You have it in your own communities or very near that you can travel and get exposed to it. In the United States, get involved with groups that you know, come from, let's say, the Dominican Republic or Haiti or Africa. So you don't necessarily have to travel there to get exposed to a lot of this. You can do it within your own communities.
Great, thank you. The last question, one of the things I've done is ask prior speakers to ask future speakers questions, and culling through the list, I think one from a speaker that we had last year who was, came to us from the University of Houston and was a political risk analyst in a prior life for the oil industry, asked a good question that I think is relevant for both of you. What do you see as the single event that you could anticipate being a fundamental game changer in the world of renewable energy, especially for the developing world? And if it were to happen, how would it evolve your thinking about what our future is around energy? What could change the whole kit and caboodle? That's a term I haven't used ever before.
I would say aid.
Okay.
I think that, yeah, I would say aid. I think I take Haiti as an example. Haiti has had a lot of help, and it really hasn't advanced too much economically, energy-wise, health-wise, and it has had so much help. I mean, corruption plays a role in it and that development at all, but I think if aid were to be gone, or sort of that interest of developed countries is gone, I think will change the dynamic completely.
For the better or worse?
I think for the better. I think for the better, because like I've sort of touched upon it, I think the developed world takes advantage of a lot of that.
Okay.
It takes advantage of both the aid and maybe trade and economic trade. So it will be for the better.
Interesting.
And it has been historically, you know, the colonialism. I think if that it sort of has morphed over time, but there essentially is a form of colonialism now in our economic system.
Interesting, very interesting. Thoughts?
You know, I think it's a very good point. I think the effective use of the limited resources we have, you know, if we can align things better and efficiently, but a game changer, you know, magic bullets, I'm not really hoping for that. I'm really kind of looking at, you know, a lot of things moving forward and not necessarily one game changer. I mean, other than that, I suggest that we need to continually kind of as a species increase our awareness of the need to collaborate internationally and focus on this almost as if it were a, you know, like, you know, how things were aligned for World War II to fight off the war, or whether it's a moonshot. I mean, really get the human talent, you know, lined up to address what I do feel is a need to get on a low carbon path, and it requires developed countries and developing countries. And I really think we need the international respect is, I think, almost what Lyoness is referring to. We have to be on a level playing field in terms of all humans on the planet and not taking advantage. And so let's keep aligning ourselves and recognizing the urgency and people from different fields helping to do, you know, advance this transition. That's my sense. There's no silver bullet, but there's a process we need to go through, and I do hope that awareness will increase and we'll get focused.
And before I open it up to the audience, then we'll have speakers again starting in the fall. I haven't laid that groundwork yet. I'll need to call on some of my faculty colleagues for ideas and as we move forward to what the next steps of all that's going to look like. But what should I ask him? The next one, the next speaker, what should I ask him or her when they're sitting here that you ask of them to continue this conversation? Put them on the spot.
Well,
This is the hardest question.
I haven't even thought of this. Do each of us come up with a question, or?
Sure. I can't ask them all, right? We really would be here for 2 or 3 hours, but I always pick out one that was from the past and then try to make it relevant to the perspective that you bring.
You let him know this guy, Richard Hansen, was here, and
Okay.
he was concerned about us kind of getting a focus and getting aligned and moving forward on the kind of global transition on low carbon paths, sustainable energy. And the question really is, do you think we can pull it off in time to protect our, our great-grandchildren, basically, so that they aren't in a, state of a lot of crisis and displacement, and what could happen if it goes to where we don't want it to go. So will we do it in time? I think that's the clock is ticking,
That's a good question. Have you thought of one, or do you want to punt?
I think I want to punt. That's a good one, I can't, I sort of want to create one, and was thinking of creating one. Yeah, I'll just punt. I'll just forget about me.
I'm going to ask the audience for questions. You keep thinking and
Yeah,
let us know. All right?
there we go.
I think they have an extra mic for me in the back. And so, as I always do, open it up to questions to the audience. And for people who have been here before, you know that I see students first. So the public, of course, even faculty are welcome to ask questions. But students, for some reason, they just glow in the dark, so I see their hands first. And of course, if I don't see their hands, then I call on them individually.
Hi there. I was wondering, do you believe it's more beneficial to train the people down in the Dominican, or is it more beneficial to bring students from our area or from the United States down to help out with these issues? I was just wondering something like that.
My sense is that the local capacity is really what needs to develop. I think there's a great value in students getting exposure to developing country settings, particularly if they're not from a developing country. That's more or less the case so it's an opportunity. The Peace Corps has a goal of, volunteers getting involved in community projects, but I think a bigger goal of the Peace Corps, a more important one of the goals, is really coming back with a better knowledge of how developing countries, that understanding of developing countries, and people then get, let's say, back into our society, and they may even be in Congress or wherever, and they now better understand developing countries after having lived there for a while. So I think the international exchange is important, but at the end of the day, my sense is, the more permanent, unless, let's say in your case, unless you move to wherever and you marry into the culture and you stay there, then you're really an integral part of the culture. You're an immigrant. But it's, the local capacity is ongoing, and so that's what I'm usually working on. In our company in Honduras, it's all Hondurans. I happen to be quite integrated into Latin American culture at this point, but does that answer your question?
No.
This means más o menos.
So, looking from a development point of view and seeing maybe utility scale photovoltaic systems as more on the developed end, is there a reason that we should we put more focus into creating utility scale and or like middling systems as opposed to trying to give each household their own individual photovoltaic unit, in which case we'd be, there's a lot of cost associated with that, where is it possible to just skip over all of that and go straight to utility scale things from a development point of view?
I can probably talk a little bit about that. I think there's a focus for everything. I don't think we should focus on one thing in particular, because just like in the developing world, there's a class system. It all depends. You know, our utility in the United States and in developed world, we have the lines and the infrastructure. So it's great to have utility scale in the mix, especially if we're looking to become carbon neutral. Obviously, that's important. But I think there's a need for individual, let's say, residences having their own power plant there, both for economic growth, because then I think we're giving the power to the utility and not necessarily the end user, which are homeowners or renters and whoever pays for the electricity. So I think there's a need for the whole range and a focus for everything. And that's sort of where policy plays a role. Policy is highly important in the implementation and integration of renewable energy in the developed world.
I'll add another angle on it. When it comes to like resilience, there's a couple issues. Is like if you have it more distributed around, you are potentially adding value because you're reducing the amount of distribution infrastructure. But the other thing can be related to resilience. So like in a country like Honduras or Dominican Republic, and you have power outages, you can have a grid-tied system that's also hybrid. If the power goes out in one area, you can still maintain power on in these smaller nodes, whether it's your own, it's your own building and you want that. So I think the freedom to be able to get it as an individual, if you want to have your own power system, and we've installed systems that are hybrid, so that if the power goes out because the utility's got a problem, then you still have power. And there's some movement towards even microgrids that are in areas that have grids, and you've got this for resiliency, including for like military bases or campuses that, like a military base that wants to have the resilience if the main system goes down. So I think there's a value in that. And I also think kind of the freedom of choice so that people, if they want to have their own power system, can have it. And these large-scale utility systems get very low-cost power when you get to that large scale, but then by the time it's sold on a retail basis, it could still be worthwhile for the end user to invest, because by the time they get it, it's at a retail value, and it could be a worthwhile investment for them to reduce their electric bill. So there's reason to see both, but there's some pretty impressive pricing coming in now in these large systems. So I would agree that let's not eliminate either one. I think that these utility scales have probably driven the megawatts more quickly. I mean, clearly in the off-grid areas, if you're putting in pico systems, it's not a lot of megawatts. It's really just increasing the manufacturing of the cells that much. It's certainly getting to a lot of people service, but these large projects are really kind of driving the industry and getting costs down. That's a plus.
Next question.
So earlier you kind of mentioned just briefly the bias of the global north for doing some of these things. And as a stream ecologist who studies streams and urban systems, that bias exists in my field as well, right? A lot of the way we've studied cities and how they grow and how people interact with them and how that affects the environment is based on northern cities that were developing a long time ago. And as we look to try to prevent the same ecological damage as cities grow in the south, it's a challenge. So I guess maybe my interest is do you have any advice to try to maybe elucidate how we can either inform people or get beyond that bias? Because, I'm sure if you just kind of showed the average person a small light cell, they would be relatively unimpressed if they're from the north, because the issues are more, my guess would be more larger scale. So how do you then kind of translate what you do to get around that bias to make it relevant to people who might not be familiar with what's going on in other parts of the world to make real change? And again, my interest is to try to figure out how to translate the ecology that I do to be relevant to other places than just North America.
It's tough, because a lot of our a lot of our understanding comes from experience. So if you don't have that experience, you can't really wrap your head around a concept or an idea. So I kind of want to say that education level, but also drawing upon the hardships that maybe the developed world already has and that they can see in their own backyard. Sort of like what I said earlier, like you don't really have to travel to developing countries to see that disparity. You can go to a city and see how a low-income person lives to get that understanding. So I think sort of that education and seeing will help a little bit with integrating sort of more of an understanding. Because it's tough if you don't have that background. I mean, it's tough for me whenever I go down to Dominican Republic and I'm taking a shower with a 5-gallon bucket, and I can, with that 5-gallon bucket, I can wash my hair and wash myself. Then when I come back, I'm spending 15, 20 minutes under a continuous stream of water, and seriously, I'm just like, well, I could just get a bucket and just wash myself that way. But also my own friends, they themselves, when I explain about what I'm doing and my trips, and they can't understand. So the only thing that I can do is really explain and try and give them that understanding. But because they've never experienced that, they sort of go like, oh, okay, great. Because they're my friends, they kind of give me that look of understanding, and then they go about their business, which I think is sort of the issue with a lot of the developing world and our own sort of like, like horses are giving these blinders so they don't look around. And then they go like with their own blinders. So I think with giving that exposure and that education. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I've seen interesting transitions, like with Peace Corps volunteers that live for a couple of years in a developing country, and then they try and reintegrate back in, and it's a real shock for them because of the, level of consumption here. So I think if we go back to my grandparents' generation, things were very low consumption, but we've accelerated so quickly, and I guess if people can slow down a bit and recognize that. I think that the developing countries have much to teach about, still having good community, relations and interactions, and not being isolated, and living very simply, and still having a smile because you've got your support in your community. It's a valuable. I think travel probably helps to get exposure, and particularly certain types of travel, that are so.
You had one question? Yep.
Now, have either of you pursued any studies in nuclear energy as clean energy? Have either of you ever, because it will not add to have you pursued any studies in nuclear energy? I'm sorry.
I worked in the nuclear industry with Westinghouse Electric in Pittsburgh. I'm familiar with the industry, and yes, it's another low carbon path. I've gone on the path of solar technology and made use of that for areas that don't have access, and I think it's a good piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, and I know that there's new, smaller, more modular nuclear plants that are a potential way to avoid carbon dioxide. But I haven't really gone off on a nuclear, pursuit. I've got plenty to do in the solar area, but I am aware that of the nuclear industry and.
It seems strange that nuclear energy would be considered clean energy, doesn't it? That seems like like they couldn't exist as one. That's for sure.
Well, nuclear, clean regarding the CO2 issue, so from a climate standpoint.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
the other side of it, the nuclear materials and what to do with nuclear waste, and there's other sides of is it clean or not. But I know it's considered as a potential low carbon path, but it's not, at this point it's not my area.
I heard someone say once that if clean energy would have come before the Industrial Revolution, then it would have worked well. But since our country has such a dependency upon all the power that's created, we need a bigger source to continue our power needs, to fulfill them. But I just wanted to ask about that.
No, I mean, I think that's also part of, like with developing countries, there's some potential to leapfrog because you don't have the same level of already being so invested in the existing technologies.
Sure,
Yeah.
that's just a hard issue. A hard one to delve into. Sorry.
No. I kind of wanted to add a little bit. I don't know much about nuclear at all. I sort of read an article and saw a bit of a video along with that there's a little bit of technology that's been advancing to try and make it a little bit more stable in the storage of the byproduct. But you mentioned sort of how the developed world is sort of invested in our essentially our way of life, that we need so much more energy. And so that's, I think, something that we can do as a country and as a people, is sort of look at our own consumption, is really take a step back and seeing how we live our lives. We're so comfortable with going to the store, picking up a water bottle. Well, what took to produce that water bottle? Petroleum. Plastic it has very productive uses in a lot of industries, and it's great, but it really is detrimental in how we use it, not both to the environment and with wildlife and et cetera, but it's very labor intensive in the energy usage to produce it. And so when that question that I pose, I focus on solar and the developing in Dominican Republic, but when I live my life, I try to lower my own consumption of my waste. What am I buying when I go to the store? What am I voting for? Not only when I go to the polls, but my money speaks much more than the elected officials I am voting for at the polls. I'm not going to buy from a company or something that I'm going to use for 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 10 minutes and then throwing away. That aspect is something that I think we need to look at as a nation, and it's sort of the north-south issue. Because we can focus on energy, but I think we also need to focus on every other aspects of our lives. Because not only are we showing that as an example, we're also exporting that to those countries that don't have the systems we have in place in sort of that organization. We have such an organization of our way of life here that not necessarily is in place in developed countries, and we are sort of exporting a lot of that, but we need to look at that aspect as well when we talk about renewable energy, is how are we using traditional sources here for our way of life, for our everyday things?
I showed a graph of carbon output by state. So you can see there's, a wide range. And
I'd like to see that by country.
yeah, I had one in red that had by country, a certain set of countries, and yeah, it'd be good to look at like all of them. You can see different ranges, in European countries and then developing countries. So, there's different lifestyles in terms of carbon output. So.
Sure, yes, and a lot of it, yes, I agree. And it's a total lifestyle change, a total change of thought pattern. And I think that's the one thing that that people in America rely on, is that they won't change their thinking. It needs to be something else. And that's why, that's why I think you're right that awareness is so important.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the only thing that will change their minds, is awareness.
And I think young people are sort of catching onto that, like my generation's catching onto that. But truthfully, like my grandmother or like a lot of your grandparents or parents, this sort of throwaway culture and the way that we are producing so much energy so quickly only developed in the last 50, 40 years. Before the 50s, we did have that sort of reusable culture in our way of life. We lived a little bit more slowly. That throwaway culture only sort of appeared fairly recently. And so that need for that capacity for energy really only developed in the past couple of years. So it's not like it's a shift in our life, but it's not like a brand new way of life. Developed countries do it because it's their only way, but also grandparents, that's how the United States essentially used to live.
We have time for one last question, and I've handed the mic over to our resident economist, one of them.
So you showed a graph near the beginning of your talk that talked about access, how many people have access or don't have access to electricity. And I understand that's one of your goals through the foundations that you're a part of, although I'm sure you have others. But to that end, what would you say is the biggest hindrance to furthering that goal?
I think that it's moving pretty quickly. It's moving very quickly, and I pointed out like the elements that are, 4 elements needed. You need to get the policy right, so that's needed. You need to move capital into companies that have viable business plans, and that capital is starting to move. I think there's greater amounts of capital that are probably needed. The consumer finance, I think that the pay-go technology is now starting to allow consumer finance to move in, because there's a sense that the risk of repayment has been reduced. And I think that innovation funding towards this. So I guess it's going to be probably levels of financial commitment, and some of that money needs to be the softer money that's kind of catalytic, and then another piece of it has to be investment. But that's got to be investment that's going to pay a return, or it's not going to go in there. And I think it's moving forward. And very, very recently, we're seeing traction. I mentioned a number of companies there, on sub-Saharan Africa, and it's gaining traction. So I think progress is being made. How to accelerate it? I think that probably getting more corporate commitments, like this kind of shift, because I think even managing international trade and corporations, I think that like Unilever is really capturing this sustainability issue. And so kind of the long-term viability of business is going to depend on this as well. So I think that we're going to have to sign up commitments to make this move more quickly. And we are seeing like Engie, the French energy company, large energy company, has just recently invested in a microgrid company in Haiti. They also bought a distributed solar company in it's an East African country. I'm forgetting which country they just bought it, but its company was called Phoenix. They just bought out Phoenix. I'm not sure which countries they're working. I think maybe they're in Uganda. But So, you know, they're kind of forward thinking and, you know, buying into this for reasons. I think those levels of commitments, because, you know, this donor money, and it's often maybe not even all that effective. It's only a small portion of the capital in the world, so you need to kind of get the private capital to go in this direction. And there's, you know, I think that there some of that's signing up. You know, I mentioned NG, and I think there's, you know, more coming along. So hopefully it will continue. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know you just called out the last question.
And I already gave up my mic, so I'll have to give you this one. Here you go.
Possibility of blockchain getting involved in this? In Bitcoin? That's a lot of financing from a lot of people, not just companies.
You know, I'm seeing this surface a bit. In fact, a guy that I know is doing some work with, like, even solar lanterns there. I saw the recent name called Bitlumens. Like, there's a number of these cyber currencies emerging, and I noticed there's one being started to finance and invest in. So I don't have much knowledge in that area. I know that it exists. I can see that it's starting to get into this space. So I have to plead not very up to date on that, but it's striking people's interest, and I know that people are making investments in that area, and so that was just something very recently that I saw related to these, even to these Pico PV, that another way to bring in capital for that.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fine. Please join me in thanking Richard and Liliana for their time and perspective on all this. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank the administration of Lycoming College for supporting the efforts of the Center for Energy in the Future, including our speaker series, which is also in part supported by a Williams Community Grant. And so please join me in thanking both of them. And so that brings us to the end of what I see as a very successful speaker series for the 2017-2018 academic year. We will be picking this up back in the fall, and if you have ideas and suggestions on topics or speakers that you'd like to see a part of that, please forward them towards me. I'm sure they'll be happy to hang around for a minute or two if you have additional questions one-on-one, but again, join me in thanking them.